Golden State Media Concepts Sci-Fi Podcast. Together we dive into the world of sci-fi and science fiction. From episodes of Star Trek, Star Wars, to The Walking Dead, Resident Evil, all the hot new science fiction movies from the backdoors of Marvel or DC. The Golden State Media Concepts Sci-Fi Podcast. You'll never look at science fiction the same way again.
Podcast brought to you by the GSMC Podcasting Network. I am your host, Keith, and we are back for more sci-fi fun stuff, right? This is fun. I'm having a good time, that's for sure. So I hope you all are as well. I hope you all have had a good week. I say y'all like I'm from some place that says y'all, but I'm from Northern California, so I do apologize for appropriating that word. I, for one, and I hope everybody, for one, or for all, I'm looking forward to continuing our discussion from last week in regards to the critique of science fiction and other kind of like fantasy genres. Last week we kind of included comic books into the discussion, and we'll continue to kind of include those things in the discussion this week. We focused a lot on kind of dispelling the myth that science fiction or fantasy serves as just some form of vapid, escapist-based literature that is only good for young people to escape from the harsh realities of the world around them and kind of pretend that they're a superhero for a brief moment in time. And I had kind of made an argument, I was making an argument against that idea and kind of encouraging us to think critically about science fiction and what about it the things about it that we love, and why science fiction as a genre shouldn't be written off as just a place for kind of like, I don't know, fairy tales, but with science. I made an argument last week that science fiction as a genre deserves a spot at the table of high art, and we'll be kind of elaborating on that a little bit more this week just to make things a bit more clear and to kind of refine my arguments. Because I felt that last week wasn't necessarily as succinct as I would have liked it to have been, and I didn't focus in enough on like a couple of specific things that I felt were really important in regards to the argument. And the reason that I'm addressing this is because I think that oftentimes when you go to watch something or consume a piece of media that you love and other people just kind of want to say like, oh, well, that isn't really good or it isn't high art, it just gives a little bit too much space to kind of ostracize or label individuals who like that particular genre as being not as intellectual as someone who reads like a William Faulkner novel. Not that you can't read both. Like, I've read the Star Wars Extended Universe books, and I've also read a couple Faulkner books. So you can definitely do both, but I just think that the person who thinks critically and consumes science fiction based media is just as deserving of our praise and just as deserving of acknowledgement in an academic or intellectual realm as the individual who simply does that with like high literature. And I'll be kind of going over that argument a little bit more thoroughly as we go through the podcast. But before we get to that, I wanted to put my recommendation for cool sci-fi content at the top of the podcast this week. It is a video game recommendation, so for those of you who aren't into gaming or don't have a gaming system at all, I apologize, but this is something that I'm really excited about. So it's kind of hard for me to not share it as my recommendation for the week. So Nintendo has a series of games called Mega Man X and Mega Man Zero. And then Mega Man Zero DX, I believe, is the title of the other games that are kind of included in that Mega Man Zero franchise. And they have, at several points in time, released collections of these particular games. They're available on most platforms, but the reason that I'm bringing it up this week is because Nintendo recently released the Mega Man Zero and Mega Man Zero DX games originally for Game Boy Advance and Nintendo DS onto the digital download store for the Switch. They did that on the 25th of February, so of course I purchased it. So I've been kind of reliving my youth by playing these games. I grew up playing the original Mega Man X. I remember my little sisters weren't super into video games, but they liked to watch me play video games, so I can remember trying to beat the final boss and them cheering me on. Very sweet little memory that I have. And I got into the Mega Man Zero games like towards my teenage years when I could play on my Game Boy Advance SP because it had a backlight and my parents didn't know how late I was staying up. This was back before the days of like smartphones and things like that, so much less sinister than having the internet at your fingertips late at night hiding under a blanket just to have a backlit gaming screen that has a set storyline. No way to really get in trouble with that, other than maybe missing some sleep because you love it too much. The series as a whole, both Mega Man X and Mega Man Zero, have a great storyline, and the gameplay is really simple, but feels challenging and satisfying at the same time. The basic plot of the series as a whole, so including Mega Man X, is about a conflict between like humans, androids, and mavericks. Mavericks are androids that have decided to attack humans or are trying to take over the world. The humans are essentially like useless flesh sacks that require protection from the mavericks by the androids. So you play as one of those protectors in the original Mega Man X. Mega Man X is an android created by, I believe, Dr. X is his name. And you protect humans as an android that is capable of like experiencing some part of human sentience. So like the androids have friends, they have connections, they interact with the world around them in interesting ways, and there is a story that's kind of driven by that, those ideas, those mechanics. And then you kind of interact with your creator and get like upgrades and things like that as you play through the game, which adds kind of like an interesting level of depth to it. I personally am a huge fan of the storyline, not just the gameplay. So, you know, don't skip the cutscenes, I guess is what I'm saying, though, because these games are for older systems. Most of the time you can't skip the cutscenes, which is both frustrating and cool, depending on how good you are at the game. So in the original Mega Man X, you play as Mega Man X, and you do interact with the character Zero. But in Mega Man Zero, you play as Zero in a world where a group of androids have dubbed themselves as the Guardians, and they are wantonly executing other non-Maverick androids and claiming that they're androids. So instead of fighting to protect the world from humans, you're fighting to protect other androids from these androids who have declared themselves as being the guardians of the world. The gameplay itself, again, it's simple. It's basically like a platformer / like side-scrolling shooter. I love these games, again, not just for the gameplay, but for the soundtrack, the storyline, the character design, and obviously the gameplay. So if you're a fan of video games and a fan of any of the Mega Man games, definitely check these out. Well worth the download. And just as a side note, the Mega Man X Legacy Collection Volume 2, which has like Mega Man X 5 through 8 or something like that, as well as an OVA movie that they did for Mega Man X, which I haven't seen but I've heard is pretty good. It's on sale for half off this week on the Switch store. So it's only like $10 to play through 3 or 4 games. So if you're a fan of Mega Man, or if you're a Mega fan, or a Mega nerd, pun intended, then pick those up and give those a shot. Again, highly, highly recommend. So moving on from that, we're going to kind of get straight into the content for this week. Last week we talked about a concept that I coined as cognitive distance, which does have like a real world psychological application outside of science fiction that I think correlates nicely with the way in which I'm trying to use it. Cognitive distance is defined as the conceptualizing of a distance that is too vast to view from one vantage point. So you place yourself as traveling over that distance. So cognitively experiencing that distance is within your mind. So you could think of it as the phenomena that you experience when you imagine yourself like flying through the universe. You're traversing a distance that would otherwise be more difficult to conceptualize. And the reason that I'm bringing this back up is because I think like the crux of my argument, the reason that I think that science fiction serves as such a good medium for storytelling really relies on all of us being on the same page, at least for this argument's sake, all of us being on the same page as to what is important and what science fiction does in order to solicit deep thought and meaningful portrayal of universal aspects of the human experience. So we're going to take a quick commercial break and get right back into that.
Want to find out what movies to go see? Then check out the GSMC Movie Podcast. It's your ticket to the latest movies, whether it's a new blockbuster event, romantic, comedy, or action flick. This show has got it all covered. They talk some what to go see now. Don't bother. What's hot on Netflix and everything in between. That's GSMCpodcast.com/movie-podcast. When it's all about the movies, it has to be this new show. Don't forget to like them on Facebook and follow them on Twitter. Visit GSMCpodcast.com for more info.
Right before the break, we were kind of revisiting the idea of cognitive distance, and I went over what like the everyday kind of like use of this word might be, just to kind of redefine it. And I think I might, like, I'm not sure if I am, but I don't think I am trying too hard to tie these things together. But I really think that the value of my argument lies in the recoining of the idea of cognitive distance, specifically for its use in this particular argument of saying that science fiction deserves a spot at the table of high literature. So let's make that recoining a little more precise with some actual examples from science fiction. That's why y'all come here, to hear me talk about, well, actually I don't know why y'all come here, but there I go using y'all again. A lot of people probably come here to hear me talk about other things in science fiction. So I will be talking about some other things in science fiction. Might be some stuff that I've mentioned already. I know I have a tendency to do that. I'm really sorry. There's just certain things that I think are really awesome, so I bring them up frequently. One of our most recent discussions on this podcast was on the topic of virtual reality and the number of ways that it has been portrayed throughout different works of science fiction. Now, it's not as if in our everyday lives, most of us interact with anything even remotely similar to virtual reality as we might see in a movie. Though I will say we are getting closer to a reality in which that technology might be available to us, but we'll talk about the predictive tendency of science fiction later. But because that technology is not available to us on a regular basis, or it doesn't happen to be within our everyday interactions, there is a distance between knowledge of that thing or technology, that being, in this case, virtual reality, and our current knowledge of things in the world. This distance, I think, is the main reason behind the accusation that is levied against works of fantasy or science fiction. But I also think that it happens to be one of the greatest strengths of fantasy and science fiction, so you kind of have to examine it from a couple of different perspectives. From the perspective of the person who is making a critique to science fiction, that distance necessitates an aspect of escapism, because in order to traverse the distance between concept and reality, you have to kind of forego your current knowledge of the world. And that's because the presence of the fantastic, or that which is beyond current conception or actualization, it has been categorized as being an object of fancy. And I kind of touched on this idea last week, but the reason that it's been kind of relegated to that particular part of science fiction is because of the popularization or the pulpification of science fiction in the early 1900s. During that time period, we saw a substantial number of publications that began to focus heavily on this easily consumable and pop form of science fiction, which, especially when you take into account the economic and social landscape of the time, absolutely served as a form of escapism. Science fiction saw a rise in popularity from essentially World War I through the Great Depression, at least in America. Two pivotal moments in its history where an easily consumable genre that distanced individuals from the harsh realities of the world around them was almost a necessity. So I know what you're thinking. Look at the world around us. It's full of turmoil and harsh realities, and in some ways it's even more full of those things than it was those 100 years ago. If you look at like the latest news cycle, there are likely going to be 100 plus things that you're going to want to escape from. And science fiction can absolutely be an escape from those things. And I'm not saying that it's bad if it is. But even during the popularization of science fiction those 100 years ago, I would argue that authors, while of course they were following a trend to make a living, had more profound purposes in mind when writing these stories than to simply create an escape for individuals experiencing difficulties in life. And just because the escape science fiction creates is more fantastic doesn't necessitate it being labeled as exclusively escapist in nature. And the reason for that comparison is because I don't think that the science fiction that's written today, in some cases, is of any less quality than the classic works of science fiction that we might be familiar with, some of which have been incorporated already into the lexicon of high art. But I do think that there are other pieces of science fiction that are deserving of that label that have been created in the last 50 or so years. But staying on topic, there are a substantial number of rabbit holes I could go down here. I'm not going to do that. We're going to keep talking about virtual reality and using it as an example to support my argument here. So we're going to revisit Philip K. Dick's We Can Remember It For You wholesale. This short story focused on the journey and turmoil that one man experienced in his quest to achieve his dream of visiting Mars. The story sees him in conflict with not only those whom he loves, but also like a large government organization. And ultimately, the story leads to his captivity at the hands of an organization that we as a reader aren't even sure actually exists. And it's really easy to write this piece of literature off as simply being a piece of fancy written with the intent of giving an individual an outlet with which to fantasize about a company that can make you so thoroughly believe that you have experienced something that even the threat of death and captivity cannot make you deny that experience. But I do not think a statement like that holds a ton of clout. I personally think that the story was written or has something within it that is much more profound and has a purpose that goes beyond something as simplistic as an outlet with which to hope for a fantasy world where one could simply pay to believe that they've experienced some important thing or pay to believe that they've accomplished something. And this is where we will take a tiny detour into another important aspect of science fiction. Science fiction as a genre does serve intrinsically as speculative fiction, meaning that it serves to not only hypothesize potential future occurrences, but to a degree it serves to attempt to actualize those potential occurrences through social conjecture, anecdotal science. Sometimes they try to explain it like via hard science or complex science, and empathetic interactions between characters, the setting, and those speculative aspects. So like the technical advancements, the technological advancements, the different settings. The speculative nature of science fiction is part of what defines it as a genre and adds to its value as high art because the people interacting with the different aspects of the setting or the new technologies are part of what create the distance that is necessary and that I have been referring to as cognitive distance. Now, getting back to the main point that I'm kind of trying to make here about cognitive distance, and to attempt to give some clarity to this term that I am ultimately appropriating for my own use and for our own use, right? Because science fiction is a speculative genre by nature, the content within it often solicits a certain set of responses. This is different from straightforward fantasy, which is also not escapist in nature, but that's not what I'm here to argue about. But I will say that fantasy usually has a focus more on the individualistic aspects of someone's journey rather than the sociological impact of a journey or of interactions with the world around them. And that's because fantasy doesn't rely on the same appeals that science fiction does. Science fiction relies on appeals to science, reason, speculation. Sometimes that speculation is fantastic in nature, and of course, universal aspects of the human experience. And while most of those appeals, they don't differ too drastically from traditional storytelling mechanisms, science fiction excels at storytelling because it departs so drastically from the norms of those storytelling devices via the things that we see, the tropes that we see in science fiction. We Can Remember It For You Wholesale could just as easily be called You Think You Thought That Thing, and it could be written by Edgar Allan Poe. It's a classic example of a descent into madness short story, which is a trope that we're all really familiar with, especially after the Joker movie that everyone but me has apparently seen. Yes, I know, I haven't seen it. Judge me if you will. And what's really frustrating to me is that commonly we give a lot of credence to the short story about a descent into madness that involved external factors that lack explanation, or if the descent was highlighted by a commentary on social classes and mental illness or things like that. But the science fiction piece emulating this topic is often just written off as an action movie or a wild fancy. The Joker movie is a great example. And I'm not saying that the Joker movie isn't worthy of praise or critical thought. All I'm trying to say is that a movie like The Joker is no less worthy of critical consideration than a movie like Total Recall, at least in concept. Maybe not necessarily in execution, but that is what it is. And we're going to continue talking about that right after this quick commercial break.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Hello, welcome back again. So right before the break, I had made a pretty audacious statement basically saying that Total Recall, the original with Arnold Schwarzenegger, was just as worthy of critical consideration as the most recent Joker movie starring Joaquin Phoenix, which again I have not seen. But just to give you some reasoning behind that seemingly crazy statement, my argument kind of lies in the idea of cognitive distance. The Joker is a film that requires the viewer to buy into the idea that when you combine mental illness with the proper social influencers, the result is a sociopathic madman who in the right universe becomes a mass murderer and supervillain. Nothing, though in our universe, he probably just becomes a homeless person who's undercared for, but we're not here to talk about that. Nothing is intrinsically wrong with that premise. Where my frustration comes in is that because of the proximity to the experience, it is generally more feasible for an individual to think of the Joker as having made a valuable, if not successful, attempt to capture something intrinsic about the human experience, while they would say that something like The Matrix ought to be left out as simply too fantastic for consideration. Or back to the original example that we were using, We Can Remember It For You Wholesale would be written off as just saying this is too fantastic. It doesn't actually portray some important part of the human experience like the Joker does in its kind of realistic interpretation of a comic book character. But I do not think in the end that the Joker, or even something studied in high school classrooms like The Telltale Heart, is as potentially effective as something like We Can Remember It For You Wholesale. If you were to put down on paper what it is that those stories use as the way to drive tension and move the plot forward, it would ultimately be a moral or ethical conflict between the main character and their desires, and a tension created by the questioning of what is real. The Telltale Heart questions what is real by saying you can't trust your mind if you are experiencing cognitive dissonance, which is like a conflict between what you believe and what your actions in the world and your perception of the world. We kind of mentioned that last week. And We Can Remember It For You Wholesale is essentially saying you can't trust yourself or anyone else because even the cognitive dissonance you're experiencing could be synthetic. And Philip K. Dick's story does this through something that many consider to be fantastic, especially at the time of its publication. And while science fiction does not rely on fear-mongering in order to achieve its success, the fear created by this more fantastic explanation of the descent to madness, in my opinion, ought to solicit a lot more discussion than just, as an example, Poe's story. So where most people would say the weakness of science fiction lies, that being the fantastic elements within the story, that is where I would say its greatest strength is. And that strength is what I'm labeling as cognitive dissonance. Poe's story solicits personal examination, that's very alliterative, by turning the gaze inward through a mechanism that has minimal cognitive distance from the reader. The idea of, I feel bad about murdering someone and it's driving me crazy, is not a very distant idea for those of us in our everyday lives. So if we're quantifying the ability to relate to the subject matter, quantifying it through distance, the degree of separation from Poe's concept is minimal, because most of us would probably feel bad if we killed somebody, and if we had any sense of right or wrong and we hid the body under the floorboards, it would probably freak us out a fair amount. So conceptualizing that, there's not a ton of cognitive distance there. Now, let's apply the same method to Philip K. Dick's short story. How separated are we from this concept, that being virtual reality, even 54 years after the story's publication? Is it even within our realm of everyday interactions that we could drive to a place of business where memories could be synthetically inscripted into our conscious or subconscious? The degree of separation is much more substantial in Philip K. Dick's story than it is in Poe's story. And because of this substantial distance from the concept, we are forced to adopt an even more radical vantage point from which to engage in the story, thus creating more cognitive distance between ourselves and the world around us, which in turn solicits a viewpoint from which we can more effectively observe the reality that we would be familiar with. This is where the strength of science fiction lies, and why it is such an effective storytelling genre. Because the vantage point from which we engage in the story forces us as individuals to further distance ourselves from that which is familiar. We are able to gain better insight on those things that are familiar to us and be in a place where the examination of those things can solicit a more empathetic response. and more accurately reflect something that is truly universal to the human experience. And this is the primary reason why I would argue that science fiction really does deserve a place at the table when it comes to allocating the title of high art to specific works of fiction in all forms of media. Now, of course, not every science fiction novel, movie, etc. is worthy of the title of high art. There are pieces of science fiction that only get us halfway there. They create the cognitive distance necessary for buy-in, but they don't move the reader towards the next steps of reflection or even personal application. I would argue that movies like Star Wars and some young adult books in the genre do this. They get us to the point where they have solicited buy-in and then keep us there without making us turn around and say, oh, hey, look at that thing way back there that I am familiar with. Holy cow, that's what that thing looks like from here? How could I ever have thought that way? Or how can I be so naive to this reality? And the reason that I would say, like Star Wars as an example, it would fit more into the realm of like kind of escapist content or escapism-based content is because while it does kind of take universal aspects of the human experience and portray them for us in a clearly science fiction realm, it doesn't make us turn around and look at anything critically. To understand the movie, even on a critical level, in my opinion, you really only need a somewhat anecdotal knowledge of like the mono myth, that being the hero's journey that we went over, what was it, like 5-6 weeks ago, the first episode of the podcast that I did with you guys. So if you have just even that anecdotal knowledge, then you can get a pretty accurate interpretation of Star Wars as a whole and pretty much everything, every movie or book that's available within that universe. I will say there probably are some books in the extended universe that do a little bit better job than like the movies do. But if you're just kind of looking at the content that most people are familiar with, then there is an argument to be made that that isn't a piece of high art, quote unquote. And to say high art doesn't mean that it's not worthy of like critical discussion. It's just more that it wasn't created with the intent of making people question something intrinsic about the human experience and asking what the results of questioning that would be, which is where I think most things kind of start to separate themselves as being high art, is that they force you to ask questions about that which you're most familiar with and put you in a place where you're going to have to examine those things. So I'm going to kind of wrap up this argument right after this next commercial break.
Watching TV has changed over time. Streaming has become the new norm. That's why Golden State Media Concepts television podcast dives headfirst to the world of cord cutting. Want to be on the loop of what's hot in Netflix? Or if it's not a preference, what about original shows in Hulu? We've got you covered. Join us as we fill in the blank and talk about movies to stream and what show you should be binging. This is the Golden State Media Concepts television podcast.
Hello again. Right before we left for that wonderful commercial break, I was just finishing up making a statement about how Star Wars is kind of not necessarily high art or high fiction or even high science fiction, and basically called it a form of escapist media. So counteracting my own argument, at least in part, but I want to kind of clarify that just a little bit before we get out of here. So as we finish up this discussion and to muddy up the waters a little bit more, I want to get back to what I started this conversation with last week, and that is an attempt at encapsulating or describing science fiction as a genre within a succinct statement. Back in the first week of the podcast, I described science fiction as containing 4 primary elements. An actualization of something that is beyond human. I used specifically like Ray Bradbury's The Martian Chronicles, the movie Annihilation, and the concept of the shimmer, as well as H.G. Wells' Invisible Man, Time Traveler, War of the Worlds. It also includes world building that creates something beyond what we currently know. And this is really similar to fantasy novels. I do think that there is kind of like a Venn diagram. I've mentioned this before of like science fiction, fantasy, and literature, and there's places where they all align. But I mentioned specifically like Harry Potter or Artemis Fowl. Artemis Fowl is getting a movie. I mentioned that last time. I don't know when it's coming out, but it should be fun at least. And I kind of said in that first week that all science fiction is fantasy, but not all fantasy is science fiction. I would still relatively stand by that statement. And it also includes the consequences of interfering with extra-human forces, such as what happens with the Force in Star Wars, or with Formix or Buggers in Ender's Game, invisibility or time travel, evolution, like the Planet of the Apes films, 2001 Space Odyssey, so the apes' interaction with this knowledge-granting obelisk type thing. And then lastly, I said that science fiction also includes the presence of transcendent, oppositional, or archetypal knowledge, super/extra-human powers, the introduction of sentience, psychic powers. All those things are examples of that. And you could also phrase it as the presence of a reality alternative to our own that forces a character into a place of discomfort, juxtaposition, or revelation. And while I would maintain that those are all elements of science fiction, I believe they are all kind of circling around what I would want to say ultimately defines science fiction. So I want to kind of get a little bit more succinct than those 4 bullet points. So I mentioned last week this idea of novum, which is a novum, by the way. I don't know if you heard the M at the end of that. M as in mom. The Latin term that basically means new. And several individuals used this as their baseline for what makes science fiction science fiction. But I would say that this term and their use of it only partially describes what it is that defines science fiction as a genre. By this basic definition, it could be easily argued that most things could fall under the genre of science fiction. To a degree, even that Edgar Allan Poe story I mentioned earlier could be considered to be a form of science fiction, because sympathizing with a murderer's descent into madness could easily be argued as new knowledge. If I myself have never murdered or experienced the moral conflict of the main character, which I haven't, just to be clear. So before we end today, I wanted to kind of leave us all with something more to ponder on or chew on this particular subject, and add something to our definition of science fiction that supports my previous arguments for science fiction's quality as a genre. I would say that in order for something to fall under the genre of science fiction, it must contain something I am coining as novi aliena, or the idea of the new alien. I just wanted to use Latin and include the kind of the word novum. So novi aliena, or aliena, is just new alien in Latin. I do think that novum deserves some credence when it comes to defining all of this, so I just want to make sure that I include it. And this is also the way in which we might have a scale to judge if science fiction is like high art science fiction or just kind of like pop science fiction, both of which are great. We're just specifically focusing on kind of categorizing what makes something really good and transcendent, rather than something that's really just good and fun or pop culture transcendent and is going to penetrate into the zeitgeist. So by new alien, I mean new knowledge that solicits a necessary amount of cognitive distance that is then leveraged as a vantage point by which to re-examine some intrinsic aspect of the human experience, like virtual reality, or the short story by Ray Bradbury about the last man on Mars being unable to get along with the last woman on Mars, which is as predictably funny as you would think it is, and not sexist, which is really great, because oftentimes when you look at stories like that, they are a little misogynist. So Ray Bradbury does a good job of navigating that. Anyway, both of those things portray something intrinsic to the human experience in ways that are sufficiently distant, aka cognitively distant, from our everyday interactions with things like reality or conflict with other human beings, both of which are absolutely universal aspects of the human experience, in a way that is new and alien, because it is so distant from our everyday participation in that part of the human experience. It is nearly impossible for us to imagine the realities associated with the concept of virtual reality in Philip K. Dick's story. And it would be equally difficult for us to conceptualize or imagine the reality of being the last person on an entire planet, only to find out that there is one other person who you can somehow still manage to not get along with. So these works are clearly within the purview of science fiction as a genre, whereas Poe's story, The Telltale Heart, is not within the purview because it has not created sufficient cognitive distance to force the acknowledgement of something new and alien to our everyday experience. And the reason I bring up Poe's story is because I had said earlier that based on the previous definition, you could associate that as being a science fiction story. I'm saying that it cannot be because the premise and the tension and the storytelling mechanics do not solicit the necessary amount of cognitive distance to define something as being science fiction. Now, it does, of course, merit critical consideration and thought, but it does not do so, Poe's story does not do so from a vantage point that forces an individual into an alien place, and it does not create something foreign enough to be considered alien. So in light of all of this, I want to try and write my own definition of what makes science fiction and what makes good science fiction, in my opinion. Science fiction can be defined as the following, according to Keith Cook. Don't take this to the bank. I don't think it'll be worth anything. Regardless, this is a podcast. I'm having fun. As science fiction is defined as a story that features or relies on mechanisms that solicit sufficient cognitive distance so as to force the creation of the novi aliena and use this vessel as a way to turn the gaze back to their original starting point. This is why H.G. Wells, just as an example, was able to write such meaningful work. Because despite using familiar settings, like literally the world around him during the time period in which he existed, he was still able to create sufficient distance from the everyday to create a new alien. New knowledge, in my opinion, simply is insufficient to describe what it is that is necessitated by critical thought on good works of science fiction. I've talked at length about the importance of the alien in science fiction. I did a whole podcast on it. I recommend it. I thought it was a good one. And I would argue that the presence of the alien is really the defining factor of science fiction as a genre. And I say alien as a symbol, not alien like specifically as like somebody from outer space. Just alien as a symbol in general, as a storytelling mechanic. And there is a reason that often the alien does literally come from an unfathomable distance to interact with the things that we are most familiar with. But what science fiction is capable of doing that other genres are not as capable of doing is saying, what if that alien is really sitting on your shoulder the entire time? What if this terrifying or fantastic or enlightening presence has been there all along and you simply could not acknowledge it because you were too close to the forest to see the trees? Cognitive distance forces us to acknowledge the existence of the new and the alien and the new alien. And then good science fiction makes us realize that it has been there all along by turning us back around to face it. And this is why I think that science fiction really deserves to have a place at the table, and why things like what Bill Maher said, we mentioned this last week, about comic books, have no place within discussion of what makes high art. the accusation of something being too fantastic or too far-fetched falls on the reader and not on the story itself. It is up to the individual reader to determine, or the individual consumer, to determine whether or not the sufficient distance has been reached for them to be able to and feel comfortable with turning around and facing the realities of the human experience that they are so often denying. The realities that could have perhaps drawn them into science fiction or comic book movies in the first place. And simply making a blanket statement about how all of those things are childish or they're too fantastic really takes the responsibility out of the viewer's hands and says that things and art they have like objective intentions, or that they have their own intentions. That's just not the way that, in my opinion, art works. But we're not here to talk about the philosophy of art. We're here to talk about science fiction. So all of that to say, I don't think that statements that are kind of blanket statements that say science fiction isn't a high art genre, or that science fiction doesn't do anything for individuals who consume it, I just don't think that those are accurate. I don't think that those are worthwhile. I don't even really think they're worth consideration. They're definitely worth arguing against, hence why we've had 2 podcasts on this very subject. I personally am really passionate about the fact that science fiction deserves a spot at the table when it comes to academia and intellectualism. But you can kind of let me know your thoughts, let your know me thoughts. Anyway, I know my thoughts. I know me thoughts. Whatever. You can let me know your thoughts either in a review, you can Twitter at us, you can comment. So definitely make sure to engage with this content if you feel like you want to. That's all I have for you this week. So definitely leave a review, or again, like I said, comment or tweet at us. I think it's GSMC SciFi Podcast. So feel free to tweet at us. Thank you again for listening. Really do appreciate it. Don't forget to hit that like and subscribe button if you enjoyed the content. I'll be back next week. Don't know what I'm talking about just yet. Been trying to do a preview for the last couple of weeks, but wasn't able to come up with anything this week. So it'll be a surprise. I hope you're all as excited as I am. Have a great week, everybody.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Sci-Fi Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network, from movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.